Okay, so this one's really grabbed my attention. Gotta say, the story of this Zanetti train. I mean, just the name itself sounds like something out of a movie, you know?
It does have that sort of old world mystery feel to it.
Yeah, and the basic idea here, a train that supposedly just vanishes. It's like something out of one of those classic sci-fi stories.
It's that blend of the ordinary, something we all kind of understand, trains, schedules, tracks, and then this completely extraordinary concept of time travel.
Exactly. Like you said, ordinary trains and extraordinary events, a train just disappearing. It's a story that taps into that fascination we have with things that we can't really explain.
It plays with our sense of reality, right? Trains are supposed to follow a set path, be predictable, and then to have one just vanish outside of any normal explanation, it's unsettling, but it's also incredibly intriguing.
So for everyone listening, let's paint a picture here. The core of this story is the Zanetti train, a train that supposedly disappeared. And there's debate about where it was from. Italy is the common idea, but even that's not 100% clear. Same with what it was carrying passengers freight. Who knows?
The details get hazy as you start digging deeper.
Exactly. The main thing is it just disappears. Not a derailment, not a crash, not a typical train accident. It's just gone. Poof!
Which, of course, is what fuels the speculation.
Right, because the central claim of the Zanetti train story isn't just that it disappeared, it's that it vanished because of some sort of temporal anomaly.
A rift in time. A glitch in reality.
Yeah.
Something that pulled this train out of our normal flow of time.
And that's where this whole thing gets so interesting, because it forces us to think about the very nature of time and how we understand it. I mean, is it even possible for something like that to happen?
And I think that's the real hook of this story for a lot of people. It throws our everyday understanding of the world out the window and asks us to consider possibilities that seem completely impossible.
So that's our mission with this deep dive today, to really dig into this Zanetti train mystery, or conspiracy, as some people call it. We're going to look at the core arguments, the so-called evidence, the attempts to debunk it, and maybe even more importantly, try to understand the psychological and sociological factors that make a story like this so appealing.
It's a fascinating case study in how information spreads and how we interpret the unknown.
So let's start with the core tenets of this Zanetti train story. What are the fundamental beliefs that people who buy into this whole thing hold on to?
I'd say the first and most obvious one is the disappearance itself. We're not talking about a minor delay or a train that went off course. This is a train that seemingly vanished into thin air.
Like it never existed.
Exactly. And that immediately takes us into the realm of the unexplained. And then, of course, you have the temporal anomaly aspect. This idea that the train didn't just disappear in a normal way. It somehow jumped through time, slipped into another dimension, whatever you want to call it.
So the how and the why of the disappearance are just as important as the disappearance itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not enough to just say the train is gone. You have to propose an explanation that goes beyond the ordinary.
And the story doesn't end there. There's this whole other layer of speculation about what happened to the train after it vanished. Did it reappear somewhere else?
Some versions of the story say it reappeared briefly, maybe for a few minutes or hours before vanishing again. Others say it reappeared in a completely different time period, like maybe it popped up in the 1800s or even further back.
So this is where the time travel element really comes into play.
Right, it's not just that the train vanished. It potentially traveled through time, either intentionally or accidentally.
And of course, with any good mystery or conspiracy theory, there has to be a reason. Why did this happen? How could a train just disappear and potentially travel through time? And that's where the idea of secret technology comes in.
It's the go-to explanation for a lot of these unexplained phenomena. Some people believe that the Zanetti train incident was the result of some kind of secret government experiment or military project, something involving technology that's far beyond what we publicly know about.
So we're talking about like top secret time travel experiments, things like that.
Exactly. And this feeds into the next core tenet, which is the idea of a cover-up.
Oh yeah, if something this crazy actually happened, you can bet that someone somewhere would want to keep it quiet.
Right. The logic is, if there's secret technology involved and potentially a major incident caused by it, then the powers that be, governments, organizations, whatever, would absolutely try to cover it up to prevent mass panic maybe, or to protect their secrets.
So the lack of an official explanation or any clear acknowledgement of the incident that's seen as proof of the cover-up.
Exactly. The silence itself becomes evidence.
And then you have the signs, the clues that people who believe in this story point to as further evidence.
These are often little details, anecdotes, rumors, things that on their own might not seem like much, but when you put them all together, they create this sense that there's something more to the story.
So what kind of signs are we talking about specifically?
Well, one common one is alleged discrepancies in historical records, like train schedules or logbooks that are missing entries or have gaps around the time that the Zanetti train supposedly disappeared.
So it's like they're looking for those little inconsistencies that suggest something was deliberately erased or hidden.
Exactly. Then you have the whispered accounts from supposed witnesses or people who claim to have connections to the railway industry. These are often secondhand stories or rumors that have been passed down over time.
The kind of things that start with, my uncle's friend worked at the train station and he said.
Right. And then there are the claims of unexplained anomalies at the location where the train supposedly vanished. Things like strange electromagnetic readings or unusual weather patterns.
It's like they're looking for any kind of unusual activity that might suggest a temporal rift or some other strange phenomenon.
And of course, the lack of an official explanation itself is seen as a major sign by believers. It's like they're saying, if there's nothing to hide, then why won't anyone tell us what really happened?
So it's a combination of these little details and the absence of a clear explanation that fuels the belief in the Zanetti train story.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how the unknown can be filled in with speculation and how our desire for answers can lead us down some interesting paths.
Okay, so we've laid out the core tenets of this story, the basic beliefs that people who subscribe to this theory hold. Now let's look at the so-called evidence that they often cite. What does it actually consist of?
Well, as we've already touched on, a lot of it comes down to anecdotal accounts.
Yeah.
Stories and rumors that are passed around online or through word of mouth.
Like those online forums and message boards where people share these little snippets of information.
Exactly. And the problem with these anecdotal accounts is that they're very difficult to verify. They often lack specific details, dates, names, locations, and it's hard to trace them back to a credible source.
It's like a game of telephone where the story gets changed a little bit each time it's told.
Right. And while some of these accounts might be genuinely believed by the people sharing them, they're not really evidence in the traditional sense.
And then you have the alleged discrepancies in historical records that we mentioned earlier. What's the problem with relying on those as evidence?
Well, for one thing, historical records, especially from the time period when this train supposedly disappeared, are often incomplete or contain errors. It's not unusual to find gaps or inconsistencies, and it doesn't necessarily mean that something nefarious is going on.
So just because a train number is missing from a logbook or there's a gap in a schedule, it doesn't automatically mean there was a cover-up.
Right. It could just be a simple mistake or a result of poor record keeping.
And on top of that, even if there are genuine discrepancies, it's really difficult to prove that they're related to the Zanetti train specifically. There could be any number of explanations that have nothing to do with time travel or conspiracies.
Exactly. Correlation doesn't equal causation, as they say.
And what about those unexplained anomalies that people sometimes talk about? Are there any credible reports of strange phenomena at the supposed vanishing point?
Most of the claims of strange phenomena are anecdotal, just like the other evidence. There are stories about unusual electromagnetic readings or odd weather patterns, but these reports are rarely backed up by any hard data or scientific measurements.
It's like they're taking anything out of the ordinary and interpreting it as evidence of something paranormal or supernatural.
And it's easy to see how that can happen when you're already primed to believe in a certain narrative.
And of course, there's the lack of an official explanation, which, as we've discussed, is often cited as proof of a cover-up. But couldn't there be other reasons why there might not be a clear explanation available?
Absolutely. Just because there's no official statement or report doesn't automatically mean there's a conspiracy. It could be that the incident was never properly investigated, or that the records have been lost over time, or it could be that the explanation is simply mundane and not worth making a big deal about.
So the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence.
Exactly. It's important to consider all the possibilities and not jump to conclusions based on incomplete information.
Okay, so we've talked about the evidence or lack thereof. Now let's shift gears and look at the counter-arguments, the attempts to debunk the Zanetti train story. What are some of the main criticisms that skeptics raise?
Well, as we've already discussed, the biggest one is the lack of verifiable evidence. Almost everything about this story relies on anecdotal accounts and unconfirmed rumors. There's no hard proof that the train ever existed or that it vanished in the way that people claim.
So it's all based on hearsay, essentially.
Pretty much. And while hearsay can be interesting and entertaining, it's not a reliable foundation for building a factual case.
And even if we accept that the train did exist and that it disappeared, is there any reason to believe that it was due to a temporal anomaly rather than a more conventional explanation?
Not really. There's no scientific basis for the idea that trains can travel through time. And while it's certainly a fun concept to think about, there's no evidence to suggest that it's actually possible.
And the alleged discrepancies in historical records that we discussed earlier, skeptics argue that those could just be due to errors or incomplete data?
Exactly. As we mentioned earlier, historical records are often messy and inconsistent. And it's not unusual to find gaps or mistakes. It's more likely that these discrepancies are the result of human error or the limitations of record keeping at the time, rather than a deliberate attempt to cover something up.
It's like that saying, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity.
Right. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the most likely one.
And some skeptics have pointed out that the Zanetti Train story has a lot of similarities to other urban legends and folk tales, stories about vanishing ships or planes or people that have been passed down through generations.
It's a common motif in folklore, this idea of something disappearing without a trace. And it often reflects our anxieties about the unknown and our desire to make sense of things that we can't explain.
So the Zanetti Train story might just be a modern version of an age-old tale?
It's certainly possible. And it's worth noting that urban legends often evolve and change over time as they're retold and embellished. So the story that we hear today might be significantly different from the original version, if there even was one.
And you mentioned earlier the power of suggestion. How does that play into our willingness to believe in stories like this?
Well, if you're already inclined to believe in time travel or conspiracies or the paranormal, then you're more likely to interpret ambiguous information in a way that confirms your existing beliefs. You're looking for patterns and connections, even if they're not really there.
So it's like our own biases can influence how we perceive and interpret evidence.
Exactly. And the internet has made it even easier for these kinds of stories to spread and for people to find communities that reinforce their beliefs.
It's like an echo chamber where everyone's agreeing with each other and the dissenting voices get drowned out.
And that can make it even harder to step back and critically evaluate the evidence.
And for me, one of the most convincing arguments against the Zanetti Train story is the complete lack of any physical evidence. If a train really did vanish into thin air, you'd expect there to be some kind of trace, something left behind.
Right? You'd think there would be some wreckage or debris, or even just a mention of the incident in some official report or investigation.
Yeah.
But there's nothing. None whatsoever.
And that's a pretty big hole in the theory.
It's a major problem. Because without any physical evidence, it's all just speculation and conjecture.
Okay, so we've looked at the evidence and the counter-arguments. Now let's talk about the why. Why do stories like this capture our imagination so much? What are the psychological and sociological factors that make them so appealing?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors is the allure of time travel. It's a concept that has fascinated humans for centuries. This idea of being able to step outside of the linear flow of time and visit the past or the future, it's incredibly appealing.
I mean, who hasn't fantasized about going back in time to change something or see a historical event firsthand, or traveling to the future to see what the world is like?
It's a very human desire to escape the constraints of our present reality and explore the possibilities of what could have been or what might be.
And I think there's also that element of mystery and intrigue. The Zanetti Train story is like a puzzle that people are trying to solve. It's a challenge to their intellect and their imagination.
Right. It's a way to engage with the unknown and to try to make sense of something that seems impossible.
And then there's the distrust of authority that we talked about earlier. For some people, the idea of a government or some other powerful organization covering up something this big is very believable. It fits into their worldview and it reinforces their skepticism.
Especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information and misinformation, it can be hard to know who to trust. And for some people, it's easier to believe in a conspiracy than it is to accept the official narrative.
So it's not just about the story itself, it's about the underlying beliefs and attitudes that people bring to it.
Exactly. And then we have to consider the influence of popular culture. Movies, books, TV shows, video games, they've all played a role in shaping our understanding of time travel and other paranormal phenomena.
I mean, think about all the time travel stories that we've been exposed to, from Back to the Future to Doctor Who to Interstellar. They've made the concept of time travel seem almost familiar, even though it's still purely science fiction.
And that familiarity can make it easier to accept stories like the Zanetti Train as at least plausible, even if we don't have any real evidence to support them.
It's like we've been primed to believe in the possibility of time travel, even if we know deep down that it's not real.
And the internet has played a huge role in spreading and amplifying these kinds of stories. It's created a space where people with shared interests can connect with each other and share information, whether it's accurate or not.
So the Zanetti Train story can spread like wildfire online, and it can be hard to contain or debunk once it's out there.
Right, and because the internet is so vast and decentralized, it's easy for these stories to persist even after they've been debunked. They
Yeah.
just keep circulating in different corners of the online world.
So it's a combination of these factors that makes stories like this so enduring and so compelling.
The allure of time travel, the mystery, the distrust of authority, the influence of popular culture, the power of the internet. They all contribute to our fascination with the Zanetti Train and other stories like it.
Okay, so we've explored the story, the evidence, the counter-arguments, and the underlying factors that make these kinds of stories so appealing. Now let's talk about the dangers. What are some of the potential downsides of getting too invested in a story like this?
Well, I think one of the biggest dangers is the spread of misinformation. When we uncritically accept and share information that's not supported by evidence, we contribute to a culture where it's harder to distinguish between fact and fiction.
And that can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. It can lead to poor decision-making, a distrust of legitimate sources of information, and even conflict between people who hold different beliefs.
And in the case of the Zanetti Train story specifically, it can also distort our understanding of history. If we focus too much on a fictionalized account of a supposed event, we might lose sight of the real historical events and complexities that shape the world we live in today.
Right. It's like we're replacing real history with a more fantastical version, and that can be problematic.
And there's also the potential for wasted time and resources.
Yeah.
If people are dedicating significant time and energy to investigating a story that's ultimately based on nothing, that's time and energy that could be spent on something more productive.
It's a classic example of opportunity cost.
And it can also lead to a sense of disillusionment or disappointment when people realize that the story they've invested so much in isn't real.
It's like a bubble bursting.
And that can lead to a distrust of information in general, which can make it even harder to engage with complex issues in a meaningful way.
It's a vicious cycle.
So while stories like the Zanetti Train can be entertaining and thought-provoking, it's important to approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking.
It's all about finding that balance between curiosity and critical thinking.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Zanetti Train mystery, I think it's worth asking ourselves why we're so drawn to these kinds of stories. What is it about the unknown and the unexplained that captures our imagination so much?
I think it's a reflection of our innate curiosity as humans. We're constantly seeking to understand the world around us and to make sense of the things that we don't understand. And when we encounter a story like the Zanetti Train, it offers us a glimpse into the realm of possibility. It makes us wonder, what if?
And for those of you listening who are interested in getting informed without getting overwhelmed, I think this story is a great example of the importance of critical thinking and media literacy.
It's crucial to be able to evaluate information from a variety of sources and to be able to identify bias, misinformation, and logical fallacies.
And to remember that just because something is interesting or entertaining doesn't mean it's true.
Exactly.
So as you continue your own journey of learning and discovery, remember to ask questions, be skeptical, and always seek out evidence to support the claims that you encounter.
And never be afraid to change your mind when presented with new information.
And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Zanetti Train mystery. But I'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. What does the enduring appeal of stories like this tell us about our relationship with time, our desire for meaning, and our fascination with the unknown?
It's a question worth considering.
Indeed it is.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, happy exploring.